Praise Lord Church. We have come together again for another session of the New Testament survey. I hope all of us have been, in some way or the other, being benefited by this whole series that we have been doing. This is the 10th session, and today we will be focusing on the Gospel of Mark, one of the shortest Gospel, but we see a very significant priority that Mark is placing on Jesus and the angle through which that he is writing this amazing gospel.
I think it starts for us, right?
Yes, I think so, yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think I lost the connection between and I was praying. I didn't recognize it. So we are going to look at the Gospel of Mark today. If there is any internet connection, it would be good if you can, if one of you could just message me so that I would know of it. Today, we're going to look at the Gospel of Mark. Nipa Pastor, can you make me a co-host? I think So when we look at the Gospel of Mark, we understand that it is very significant. It is short, but very significant in its own way. Mark doesn't start with birth narrative, or Mark has, like if we are asking a general crowd to share their favorite verse, there would be a lot of chance that those verses will not be from Mark, because Mark has missed out on a lot of these things. For example, the birth of Jesus, then the favorite parables such as the Good Samaritan or the prodigal son, as we call it, and then has absence of in the synoptics in both Matthew and the Gospel of Matthew and Luke. We see the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew and Sermon on the Plain in Luke. We see the Beatitudes. So, and we see different characters that we can relate in the other Gospels, like Zacchaeus and Thomas and Mary and Martha, and all of these people in the other Gospels. But Mark really doesn't focus on a lot of these favorite of these characters. You know, a lot of them even say that Mark has an abrupt beginning and an abrupt end. Now, a lot of us, when we take our Bibles, turn to the last chapter of Mark, if you're using a modern translation, what I mean by a modern translation is a translation which uses an earlier manuscript. We'll understand that there will be written that, you know, those verses are not part of earlier manuscripts. So we understand that there are so we call it a shorter ending of Mark and a longer ending of Mark. Which is not a major concern for today, and I might mention few things when we come to that. However, when we look at all these things, we understand that Mark has not given probably the the ideal gospel that we would like to see, from the birth to the death in a very good order, or stuff. But we see that it is a gospel of secret, a lot of mysteries hidden in this. And this is why Gospel of Mark is particularly interesting and important, and we need to spend our time in learning the Gospel of Mark. It is short, and I think we can read the Gospel of Mark at one sitting in just about an hour and a half. That's what people say. In a normal speed, if you read within an hour and a half, we can read the Gospel of Mark. It's short. It gives the important events in the life of Jesus and conveys the things. As I started last week, I still want to continue the same pattern. We look at the foundations of the gospel, or some of the essential things that the gospel is focusing on. When we look at these factors, we'll be able to understand what is he prioritizing on. And here, one of the supreme things that he prioritizes is on Christology. That is about who Jesus himself is. We turn our Bibles to Mark 1:1. We read it like this itself: the beginning of the good news about Jesus, the Messiah. Or in Greek, if we are looking at it, it'll be Christos. So it is talking about the anointed one, Jesus. So the priority, the message, the content, the fundamental foundation of the gospel is Christology itself. So to the audience of Mark, here Mark is presenting a beautiful gospel, telling them that Jesus is the Messiah. Jesus is the one who is the promised Messiah. Now, the concept of Messiah has been in this, especially in the Second Temple period that we had looked at, the intertestamental period. We understand that it went through a lot of changes. For example, some of them thought that there is going to be a Messiah who would come and conquer the Roman Empire, who has captivated them, a political sort of a Messiah. Some of them thought it might be a divine ruler, a divine person officiated by God, who will come and make them the rulers of other people. Also, they thought it would be characters like Elijah, or someone who would come back and do justice to the land. Why the people of God are suffering in many instances. However, we see their entire understanding gets overturned when Jesus is the Messiah that the Father has promised. They thought it would be by conquering the Roman Empire, but Jesus became the sacrifice for us, not just by conquering the empire, but he conquered the power of sin, the power of death, and the power of the evil one, and he is the Lord of all. And this is the message that Mark is giving out over here. But Mark's gospel is very particular because Mark's gospel record numerous miracle accounts of Jesus. This is significant because through each of the miracles, we might think that it is put over there so that we'll be able to look at these miracles and be encouraged and to pray for miracles. Yes, that is one function of it, but also it shows us the different power, the different authority that Jesus has. For example, when we see that Jesus raising the dead, we understand that Jesus has the power over death. And then when Jesus is casting out, or an exorcism is happening, we see that how Jesus has the authority over demons. And then we see when over sickness, his authority is being exercised. Over nature, his authority is being exercised. So all, when we put together, what it is pointing out to, these miracles are not pointing out to mere standing there and to encourage us to pray for miracles alone, but it is also to convey who really Jesus is. He's a man of authority, what only God could do, right? Like, for example, controlling the nature, which only the authority rests upon God, the power of life, which is only through God. Here is Jesus, who is able to do that and showing the authority that he has. The second thing that Mark uses to focus on Christology is the other teachings of Jesus. Now, though in the structural wise, though Mark doesn't have structures of teaching blocks like Matthew or Luke, we understand that there are numerous teachings of Jesus also mentioned in the Gospel of Mark. It talks about the forgiveness of sin. Now, a lot of this comes in line with a miracle or an account of healing, but we see that very strongly. He talks about how he has the power to forgive sins, and also how one's entire eternity depend upon him, and how the Sabbath is made, or what is the purpose of the Sabbath. Now, we might today look at this and say it looks all easy, but for somebody at that point of time to talk against the functions and structure of Sabbath, it should be a person who has the authority to do that. And the biggest account to show the authority is stepping into the temple and showcasing the authority and authority that God had rested upon Jesus. So through all this, he also speaks about the kingdom of God, right? And the message of repentance being spoken through Jesus. And through all this, we are able to see that he's establishing who he is. Also his actions, when we look at it, we are able to understand. So teachings coming along with some of his actions. For example, appointing the disciples, signifying how he is restoring the people and making a new community for him, a new eschatological promise, a community where everyone can come together and dwell in that beautiful fellowship with God. So we see all this truly in Christ, in his own teachings. Also, Mark is very particular in the way that the titles are given to Jesus. There are various titles that are given to Jesus. Rabbi or teacher is one such title that has been given to teacher numerous number of times. Also, Son of Man is an important title that has been given to Jesus. Now, we know that Son of Man picture comes not just from the New Testament. Yes, we can look at Son of Man as understanding a humanly figure, because in the gospel itself, the Son of God is used numerous number of times. So even as Son of Man also portrays that figure of human matter, it also shows how it is a prophecy fulfillment from Daniel chapter 7, where there is going to be the human who is going to restore, who is going to judge, and who is going to rule. And that picture has been taken by the gospel writers, and particularly by Mark, and he emphasized all this very profoundly. And numerous number of times we are able to see Mark using the title Son of God. Also Son of David, to show his lineage, to show the ethnic line that he came from. The usage such as King of Jews and Lord, Kurios, a very important title in the gospel, especially because Mark signifies a lot on the lordship of Jesus Christ. And finally, as I said, Son of God is another important title which showcases, which symbolizes how Jesus is the divine being and his authority comes only from God himself. So Christology is one of the fundamental major matters in the Gospel of Mark. A second thing that we see in the Gospel of Mark, and a lot of scholars state this, messianic secret as one of the functional, or one of the things that is very profoundly that we can see in the Gospel of Mark. That means he's commanding his disciples not to reveal who he really is. Now, he does it very often. In chapter 8, we are able to see that he is telling his disciples when Peter confessed that Jesus is the Messiah, he told them not to tell this to anybody. One matter is because they have failed to understand the fuller sense of this. Because right after in chapter 8, when Peter confessed that he's the Messiah. Just few verses later, we see the instance where he is denying the plan of God. Now, if he knew that Jesus was the Messiah, he should have obeyed him. He should have just went along with the plan. But we see how they did not really get in the entire picture. And that was one of the reasons why Jesus asked them to keep this a secret. But we also see that numerous number of times in this ministry to people that he heals, to his own disciples, and to many others, him telling not to reveal who his identity is or what he has done to people. Now, it's interesting because this has something very significant, because if this is a messianic secret that is being put in according to the Gospel of Mark, if this was a messianic secret that was being hidden, in chapter 15, it is very particularly interesting, because in chapter 15, we see this account where after Jesus' death, there is a centurion who is testifying that he is truly the Messiah. Now, who gave him that revelation? Probably that is the first time in the gospel account, somebody is testifying that the crucified Jesus is the Messiah. The crucified Jesus is the Lord. So who gave him that revelation? It's a messianic secret. It's about how God functions. Now, if we ask logical explanation to this, yes, we could tell few pointers on why, but we do not know how or why in larger sense. It is all in the sovereign plan of God, and we know how he works, and his works are always amazing. And even our salvation, right? It's all his doing, his election, and all what we are is to be submissive to him and to follow him as he is the Lord of our life. The third thing is this interesting aspect. Now, if you remember last week when we looked at the Gospel of Matthew, I had mentioned that Matthew is one of the most kindest person towards the disciples. Why? Because Matthew really doesn't mention much wrongs that comes from the disciples. Yes, he mentions some of the failures here and there, but in the Gospel of Mark, it is very clearly stated that many number of times the disciples are portrayed in a very negative light. Yes, there are times when they are pictured very positively also. For example, to follow Jesus, they all willingly follow Jesus. They step forward and they follow Jesus. Also, Peter's confession that we see in chapter 8, though just a few verses later, we see that Jesus is rebuking him for stopping or for asking him not to be crucified. But we see that there are some instances where the disciples are portrayed in a positive light, but in a lot of setting, it is portrayed in a negative light. Now, this is also important for us to understand in some practical aspect, because a lot of us come and believe that the Gospel of Mark hides behind Peter. So Peter is probably the authority behind the Gospel of Mark. Most likely, it's called as even a Petrine Gospel. Now, if that is the case, and also this is the point when he is writing, which is probably the peak point of the time of Peter. Why? Because he is ministering at the various places. He is part of the Jerusalem movement. He is the leader of the church in many ways, along with Jesus's brother James. However, we see that if this is the case, he is not ignoring any of his past stories. He is not ignoring any of his past failures. And if Peter is the authority here, it is so wonderful that he humbles himself, and for the other believers, he is allowing his disciple Mark to write these narratives so that they can understand the mistakes that Peter and other disciples have had carried out. And by learning about that, they can avoid these mistakes of following for who Jesus really is. When we read First Peter, he constantly talks about suffering. if in the Gospels that none of the disciples were ready to suffer, they were always fleeing from suffering. They were always fleeing from all sorts of troubles that were coming their way. But in the epistle, when they are writing to these churches and to their own people, encouraging them, they talk from their own experiences also. They share this truth to them that, suffering for Christ is a valuable thing. And here also, Peter is ready to undergo that pain of his name being put down a little bit, but if the people can learn through that and understand about that, it is good that they don't fall into the trap of that these disciples had fell. So Mark, who stands behind Peter, kind of exposes to us this negative side of the disciples to some extent. As I said, in Matthew, they are portrayed in a very beautiful pastoral light, pictured. But in Mark, it is plainly shown that we can avoid these mistakes from our sides and focus on who really Jesus is. Now, from disciples, we're moving into discipleship, because Mark is so strongly mentioning about discipleship. Mark very clearly signify what or who is a disciple. Anytime there is the messianic predictions or the so-called passion predictions occur, we see how Mark attaches in chapter 8, I believe. He very clearly tells them that if you are to be a follower of Jesus, we have to deny ourselves, take up the cross and follow him. Very plainly, Mark puts up these pictures of discipleship. And one of the fundamental things that Mark emphasizes throughout the gospel is on what truly discipleship is all about. Now, it can be through the lives of people. It can be about how there are general invitation for people to come and follow Jesus, and how some follows him and some doesn't follow him. And there are teaching sections of discipleship and who really a disciple is about. And all these things shows us on who truly a disciple is all about. And very clearly, through Jesus's life, Mark also was showing the people what really discipleship was all about. He was portraying the life of Jesus and showcasing what truly discipleship is. It is about the decision to completely get rid of all what we have, all what we thought is ours, the life, the ambition and plans, and the so-called lordship of our life, being turning away from us and focusing on God, or the kingdom, the priority, the throne that we held in our hands in our life is now moved towards Jesus. And until this happens, Mark is not happy with this gospel readers. Why? Because he's entrusting this. He is focusing a lot on this core message of discipleship and the act of commitment of following Jesus. So these are some of the things that we are able to see about the way of the cross, especially in chapter 8, but not just limited to chapter 8, where he talks about how one has to be a disciple and what good it is for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit the soul, or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul. Somehow calling us to understand the reality of what truly Christian life is all about, what truly discipleship is all about. The final thing that I have mentioned as the foundation are the passions of Jesus. Now, when we look at this passions of Jesus, there are three passion predictions in the Gospel of Mark. But I was interested as I was reading a few commentaries and all about the introductory section on Mark. I came across this phrase. Somebody said that Mark's gospel is a passion narrative with an extended introduction. That means the major focus of Mark comes in the passion of Jesus, comes in the last week of Jesus, where he is willingly offering himself as a sacrifice for his people. So Mark gives a lot of priority to this. Chapter 8, chapter 9, and chapter 10, we see the three passion predictions of Jesus. These three passion predictions. Now, this not only is now prediction is probably not the right word to even use, but that's how we have been calling that. But in Mark chapter 8, we see this picture of how Jesus is telling his people of what what is the thing that he is going to do, or what is the purpose of his life. But the disciples are failing to understand that. They are not able to understand what the way of the cross is, and they quarrel among them, and they struggle among them, and they have the question of who is the greatest among themselves. And that was the discussion when Jesus was predicting about giving up his life and becoming a servant. The disciples were talking about who is the greatest among them. In chapter 9, almost the same instance, when Jesus, the second time, was predicting that the Son of Man is going to be handed over to the hands of men, and they will kill him, and after 3 days he will rise. And then we see that again the disciples were arguing about what they have to be and who they are, who's the greatest, and all these things that they come. And in chapter 10 also, the similar instance we are able to see. The third time Jesus is doing the passion prediction, there is the request of James and John that they want to be seated next to Jesus at his right, and the other in the left in the glory. But they missed to understand at that point of time what they were asking. And Jesus asked them, can you drink the cup I drink, or be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with? He is Jesus was talking about his suffering, what he was going to experience. But on the other side, we see how the disciples in a lot of instances fail to understand who truly Jesus is, and what his calling was. So passion narratives are primarily fundamental in the Gospel of Mark. Now, coming to some of the introductory matters, the first thing is authorship. Now, as any other gospel, the gospel writer remains anonymous in his own letter. Some people say that one reference that probably maybe that we see is in chapter 15 and 16. There is this young man who in the garden leaves his linen garment and runs away naked. Now, some of them claim that probably he is talking about this man, but there is no much of interference into this, and we don't have much things to talk about it. But we see some of these background details, especially first century writings, that helps us to talk about this. Petrine tradition is one stronger tradition that people talk about the Gospel of Mark. As I said, the author of the Gospel is probably putting himself through Peter's eyes and through what he had experienced. It is, as we have looked at the introductory sections of the Gospel, the Gospels are either by an eyewitness or based on an eyewitness's account. And here the Gospel of Mark is based on Peter, who was a direct eyewitness. So based on his account, he is writing this. And we see that we are able to see that it is probably John Mark who is the one who has written this letter, this gospel. Now, we have to understand that some background that we can dig from the writing itself is on matters like he is probably a Greek-speaking Jewish Christian who is very familiar with the Old Testament and who was very clear with the idea of that Jesus is the Son of God. So who was very convinced of this picture, wanted to present it to the people. Now, in 1 Peter 5:13, we understand that John Mark is the one who closely worked with Peter, and Peter addresses him as the son over there. And also, he was a cousin of Barnabas and accompanied Paul and Barnabas in the first missionary journey. A lot of us look at John Mark as the probably the only mistake in Apostle Paul's life, where Paul and Barnabas split up only because of only due to John Mark, where Barnabas was more encouraging and kind to John Mark, and probably traditionally they say that John Mark went along with Barnabas, and later Peter took him up as his disciple, as his son, and trained him, and he was along Peter. And so he was, in many ways, he was a travel companion of Paul and Barnabas in their first missionary journey, even though he left at some point of time. But he's also from probably a wealthy family in Jerusalem. In Acts chapter 12, we get some ideas of that, and probably the church used to happen at his mother's house. So there is some sort of Pauline picture also that we have because of the emphasis, because Paul is always seen, the center of Paul's theology is always cross and redemption and Gentiles. And we see that also to some extent in the Gospel of Mark, where he focuses cross as the center of his theology. So in similar ways, when we look at it, traditional wise, these are the early century church historians from Papias, Irenaeus, and then the Muratorian fragments or the canon of Muratorian, which is one of the earliest documents, Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian, Origen, Jerome, Eusebius, all of them. So I don't think there is any other gospel. I'm basing this argument based on what I've read. But I personally don't think there is this much unity among church fathers on any other gospel that the author comes from this account. So this is one of the strongest account that we have over here. Now there is this by Papias we have words that like this it goes. And the presbyter used to say this, and probably by presbyter, Papias would have been mentioning John. So John would have been saying this. Mark became Peter's interpreter and wrote accurately all that he remembered, not indeed in order of things or done by the Lord. For he had not heard the Lord, nor had he followed him. But later on, as I said, followed Peter, who used to give teachings as necessity demanded, but not making, as it were, an arrangement of the Lord's oracle, so that Mark did nothing wrong in writing down single points as he remembered them. For to one thing he gave attention, to leave out nothing of what he had heard, and to make no false statement about him. So here in this early statement of Papias, he mentions about how the authority that is coming in the text is Peter, and also that Mark is not trying to write an orderly account, but he is writing the eyewitness from Peter's tradition. Also, he is writing no false statement, that is accurately writing it. So his intention was not order of things, but accuracy of theological insights was probably his thing. So as I said, very, very strong evidences from the first century writings of early church fathers from second century and so on, where they ascribe it to be Mark as the author, John Mark as the author of this letter. Coming to dating, there are significant things that we are able to understand, that probably most scholars dates it between 65 to 75 Common Era. And there is one reason why they do that, is because in Mark chapter 13, it gives a significant emphasis on the prophecy about the temple destruction. Jesus is clearly telling that the temple is going to be destroyed. Now, if you turn to Mark 13, which is an important passage, so the disciples are fascinated at these buildings, but Jesus is telling them, not one stone here will be left on another, every one will be thrown down. Now, we know that this happened in Common Era 70. From 66, there were this revolt that the Jewish people had against the government. And it is in 70 Common Era that this entire destruction of the temple happens. So because of the emphasis that has been put up, people say that probably this happened before AD, before Common Era 70. And there is probably a good chance for that also. So the dating is mostly placed between this with this analysis. So there are two statements, either before 60s or most scholars place it. Now, if it is between 65 to 75, some of the significant things are that there is severe persecution following Nero's. We know the march, and also Peter and Paul and all get martyrdom at this point of time. So this is probably after. So if somebody is following the 65 to 75, that shows it is after Peter and Paul and all dead. But if it is before 60s or early 60s, it can be not before 60s, probably early 60s. Then Peter was still alive when this account was written. It was, I think, Eusebius record that Clement of Alexandria saying that Mark wrote while Peter was still alive. These are all church fathers' accounts that we have, but what is significant is this comes behind Peter, and this was before, probably before the temple destruction that we are able to see. Place of composition that happened. There are two, again, significant things. The most popular one is Rome. And now, especially because of, again, coming from the Peter's matter, because the association of Mark with Peter and Rome that we see in First Peter 5:13 and all connects with this understanding that probably this was written all the way from Rome. But also some claim that it can be from Syria also. So that's one of the understanding that people hold. But as we said that this is probably in light of the way that it is being presenting Jesus as a suffering servant. We see that how Christians, there is a strong emphasis over here showing that Christians are also going to suffer. Christians are also going to endure hardship for our Lord Jesus. And because of that, we see how probably this comes from the from Rome itself and not from any other regions, is probably what we are able to understand. Now, what is the purpose of him writing this gospel? As I started the session, definitely to showcase that Jesus is the Messiah. He wanted to clearly tell that Jesus is the Messiah. But also, this is again from a commentary, he said, this is probably Mark's aim is to help the church clarify its understanding of the meaning of the Christ event and discipleship to Jesus in a threatening, confused, and conflicted situation. And I think I related to this very well after reading Mark a lot of times. In the Gospel of Mark, it's a guide, in our 10th standard, 12th standard and all, we have these guides to help us with our main textbook. And Mark serves as our guides. Why? Because in this conflicting world, Mark is telling us that you will also endure the suffering. Because looking at the major person, looking at Jesus, Mark is telling that, oh, yes, you are also going to suffer. Yes, the other gospel writers also doesn't ignore this fact. But Mark has a particular interest going back to Isaianic oracle of the suffering Son of God, the suffering servant, that the picture that comes over there. This suffering servant imagery is so dearly taken in the account of John Mark. And he is mentioning to his disciples that they would also suffer for the sake of Christ. So in a threatening, in a chaotic, in a confused, conflicted world, he is talking to them about what truly discipleship it is and what truly following Jesus means to them. He talks about how Jesus' mission and everything is related around following him. Absolutely. It's either God's way or no way. Right? There is no midpoint of going and following him and then some other matters. It's absolutely God's way. One of the other strong purposes of this gospel is to be a counter-imperial structure. That means it is not to not to threaten the government or any of those, the Roman government or any of those sort, but very clearly, Mark uses emphasis such as Lord, kingdom, and all in strong light. Now, as I said, if this comes from that period of persecution, then these hold high weightage. Why? Because calling somebody else as the Lord can get them arrested, can get them killed. And here is Mark very boldly writing. So a counter-imperial connotation is being put over here that Jesus is the Lord, not Caesar, not any of the other Roman Empire. And this is one of the purpose of Mark. Also, Christology and discipleship, two hand-in-hand subjects for Mark. Putting it so clearly that it is understanding who Christ is, one is able to become the true disciple of Jesus. It is understanding Jesus, one will be able to follow him. And to portray that, we have this account by, showing that, the centurion himself addressing the designation that he is the King of the Jews, he is the Lord. That sort of an address it's an irony. It's actually a dramatic irony that we see, but Mark puts it so clearly in his gospel. Also, this stands as an apology for the crucified Messiah and a polemic against the imperial power of Rome. Every political power is going to come down, and that's a message that we see throughout the Bible. We have seen kingdoms arising. We thought Babylon can never go, Assyria can never fall. And through the intertestamental period, we thought Alexander can never fall. We thought Cyrus can never fall, but all of them fell. The only one that sustained, the only one that continued remaining as the Lord is the crucified Messiah. And how wonderful it is that this Roman centurion, who is a Gentile, recognized this picture of Jesus and who he really is. Some of the unique materials in the Gospel of Mark. There are at least 5 of them. One is the parable of the seed that is growing secretly in chapter 4. Then the healing of the deaf and dumb man in chapter 7. Healing of the blind man of Bethsaida in chapter 8. Sayings on the salt, and flight of young man in the garden in chapter 14, which I just mentioned some time back. Now, this is an interesting matter. In the literary features of the Gospel of Mark, we are able to understand that Gospel of Mark is, I think I have put it in the second point, that's a gospel of action than words. As I said, one of the terms titles that has been used by Mark to address Jesus is Lord. However, when we look at is the title of teacher. Now, when we look at the Gospel of Mark, though he has been addressed as teacher, there are more miracle accounts than teaching accounts in the Gospel of Mark. So, through actions, there is a sermon being preached out that Jesus is the Messiah. As I said, through healings, they are able to understand that, he has authority over nature, he has authority over demons, and so on. There's another thing. This is interesting again. When you're looking at these texts, you are able to understand that Mark uses something known as historical present. That means the event might have happened in the past, but Mark is putting it in such a way that it is in the present tense. So this is something that is very common in the Gospel of Mark, and we are able to see it at various instances in the Gospel of Mark. Also, it is the most dramatic gospel account. Because when some of the other gospel writers, even though they have more chapters and probably more words, in the Gospel of Mark, when we look at certain things, he has elaborated it much more than the other gospel writers. And this is very interestingly put up. He uses more words to describe some events in the life of Jesus more than the other gospel writers, though he has a shorter account of the gospel. Again, a very interesting thing. Throughout the gospel, Mark is a gospel of hurry in many sense, because he uses this word euthus, or immediately, very frequently in his gospel. Immediately is an important term, and it signifies a lot of things. At some point, it signifies on discipleship, it signifies on who Jesus truly is, and all of these things it can convey. So this is one of the, and in English also, if we look at this term immediately, we'll be able to understand the number of time it has been used. Again, this is a very important thing in the Gospel of Mark, what we call as a literary device called Markan sandwich. The Markan sandwich is when there are multiple accounts. And let's give an example. In Mark chapter 5, I believe, Mark chapter 5, there are, from verses 21 onwards, there is two accounts over there. So from verses 21 onwards, 21 to 24, we have the account of Jairus' daughter. So here is Jairus who comes and pleads to Jesus to heal his daughter. And then we have another account. We have a woman who has been bleeding for 12 years. The account of this woman comes over there. And then again, they go back into the older account of Jairus' woman. When we are looking at verses 35 onwards, it is again going back into the older account of Jairus' daughter. So what do we see here? It's a sandwich structure. In between one event, he is placing another event to bring out the message loud and clear of some important things. And this we are able to see very frequently in the Gospel of Mark. And it is also important because it shows us what it is all about. Okay, let's take up another very essential thing in the Gospel of Mark. When we go to Mark chapter 11, whereas Jesus is cursing a fig tree. Now here you see the structure again very clearly. Now in the first few verses, that is verses 12 to 14, here is Jesus cursing the fig tree. Right? He went and he found out that there is no fruit, and he cursed this fig tree. And then with 15 onwards, we see how there is the account of the temple, right? And what is happening at the temple? The very same thing. That means the temple is no more functional. The temple is done for. Why? Because there is a new temple, and Jesus is saying that message. But then later again, we have the same thing. Verses 20 onwards, we have what? We have the account of fig tree coming again, right? And and what is happening there? Peter is telling to Jesus that the fig tree that you have cursed has been withered. And the same thing. So what is happening here? Mark is so craftedly put up this structure in a way that the readers will understand, just like the fig tree has been cursed and it is withered, the temple is no more. It might be the most beautiful structure built by Herod, but it doesn't matter because God's presence is not there. It is of absolute no use. And now Jesus is the new temple to whom we worship. And that is a beautiful picture. And throughout the gospel, and you can look at multiple instances in the gospel. I just showed you two important accounts, but there are many, many accounts like this where you are able to see Markan sandwiches, that in between one account, you see another account put together by Mark in order to make the point loud and clear. Let's quickly look at the outline. Now, as I said, to understand any of the synoptic gospels, we first look at a prologue. And that is, here prologue is focusing on Jesus Christ, who is the Son of God. And this is so clearly, Mark is putting that imperial structures in front. They're using the language of the imperial world, such as Lord and gospel, kingdom, and all these words over there. And he is showing through John the Baptist ministry and through Jesus's own baptism and him being the coming one and all, he is portraying that Jesus is the one who is the Messiah, who is the Son of God. And then, and this is various structures like the beginning of the gospel, and then John the Baptist, who was preaching in the wilderness, Jesus's baptism, the temptation in the wilderness, and the beginning of Jesus's proclamation or ministry. And then we see how the movement goes away into Galilee, right? The shift moves into Galilee. So synoptic gospel is always prologue, moving to the ministry in Galilee. So here, Jesus' inaugural ministry in Galilee. And then he has his itinerant ministry of going around and ministering in various places and healing people. Like we see the account of Simon's son, mother-in-law being healed, and then the man with the skin disease being healed, and all these accounts that we are able to see over here. But also in this section, we are able to see how there are severe confrontations against Jesus also. There are opposition that is arising against Jesus, especially by the religious leaders. There are strong confrontations and oppositions that arises against Jesus at this point in this gospel. And there are many instances when Jesus withdraws beyond Galilee, and he chose to minister to the Gentile in chapter 7 that we are able to see. And then the ministry all the way move into Jerusalem. Now, this is especially from the account where we see Peter is confessing that Jesus is the Messiah. The gospel actually takes into different structure, or if you want to divide the gospel of Mark into two, it is still chapter 8 in one stretch, talking about who Jesus is, talking about his mission. And from chapter 8 onwards, it is actually showing us the direction that he is now going towards the cross. And that's what is happening in Jerusalem. So that is the journey towards Jerusalem, and the various instances that is happening in Jerusalem that we are able to see. On one side, here there is a large welcoming by the crowd where they sing Psalms 118 and welcomes Jesus. But also we see how this crowd later testifies and shouts to crucify him after a few accounts. So we see here his ministry in Galilee, his teachings in Galilee. Then comes an important structure from chapter 14:1 to 15:47 is the passion of Jesus. This is the structure where we see the anointing of Jesus that happened by an unnamed woman in chapter 14, and then Judas' betrayal comes in this instance. The Passover meal where he warns them about the betrayer, and also then we see these accounts of what happened to Jesus and Peter's denial and his crucifixion, and how the various trials that Jesus is undergoing and all these things happening. And after that, we see once he is crucified and once the Messiah has died, we see just like how Psalms 22 has echoed, we see how darkness had fallen at the noontime when Jesus cried out, and we see how that there were no it was all female disciples that actually stood down on that cross, and then it was a member of the Sanhedrin, the Joseph of Arimathea, who received the body of Jesus along with Nicodemus and buried him over there. And finally, in chapter 16, we have the resurrection account. As I said, so till a lot of earlier manuscripts only have verses till verses 8. But the longer ending is the account of how Jesus appeared to the women and how they goes and testifies. And then there is the commissioning of, just like how there is a Matthew commission of Great Commission, we see in the Gospel of Mark, also there is a commissioning happen. I don't intend to take on what we call as a textual criticism. Now, these are matters that deal with study of manuscripts and so on. If we are interested, we can even dedicate one section in this entire study where we can look at, there are many portions like John chapter 8, we have a similar account where it is said like that. So we can look at some of these passages and see how we can understand them in these sections. As my time is almost up, let me close with the fundamental and the primary message that Mark is telling. Mark is shouting out to the people. And the central verse, probably if you want to buy hard a verse from Mark, it should be this verse, Mark 10:45. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. As I said, the suffering servant imagery is the strongest imagery in this gospel. It's taken from Isaiah. It is taken from the prophets who suffered for the righteous sake. But Jesus becomes the ultimate sacrifice, who is a suffering servant who endured the suffering for the mankind, the innocent blood that was shed as a ransom for many, so that they can believe in Jesus and have the eternal life and have the eschatological, beautiful relationship where they can together enjoy the fellowship of God. And this is the promise that Jesus has set with his, or has left with his people. And couple of things that we see here in the Gospel of Mark, the way how it emphasized on the weaker sections, how they emphasized on testimonies of women, which was never taken consideration in any legal court in the first century context. But here in the Gospel of Mark, the suffering servant, took up that responsibility, where or through that we are able to understand how he gave his life for everyone, not just for some, not just for the elite, not just for some gender, but for everyone, right? For everyone, Jesus has given his life. And what did he do? He did not come to be served, but to serve. His life became a service. His life became, he modeled servanthood to people. He modeled that life of a servant to people. And today we are also called to do the same as God's people. As a Lord's children, we are also called to model as people who are ready to suffer for his name, but also serve him. And we know that serving God is serving God's people, serving the society, serving the people around us, serving the weaker communities around us. And it is important that we do that, because all of us, and it is not just the ministry that God has entrusted, is not limited to some, but it is for all of us to take up this attitude of servanthood and go outside and go with people and serve them in what all capacity that we can. May God help us to truly act this out, truly show this character of being a true servant, just like how Jesus became the suffering servant who took upon himself and gave his life as a ransom for many. Let us close today's